I'm very grateful to the organizers of this event for inviting me to come along and talk to you this afternoon, and in that way to become better informed myself by listening to the other speakers. In the invitation, I was asked, as I imagine everybody else was, to speak for between 10 and 15 minutes, and I will do my best not to go beyond 15. As the chairman said, there are really two reasons why I'm speaking to you this afternoon. The first is that from 1999 to 2008, I was responsible for an organization called Integrate Ireland Language and Training, which was a campus company of my university, Trinity College, Dublin, and was funded by the Irish government to serve two purposes. We provided intensive English language courses for adult immigrants admitted to Ireland with refugee status, because that was an obligation that the Irish government had under its various international agreements. And we also supported the teaching of English as a second language to immigrant children and adolescents in Irish schools, of which there were rapidly increasing numbers from the end of the 1990s onwards. The termination date of 2008 is not, of course, accidental. By the time our range of activities was fully developed, we were costing the Irish taxpayer €3 million a year, and by 2008, as I'm sure you're aware, the Irish taxpayer no longer had €3 million. Much of the work that we did in the way of developing frameworks and supports for the school sector is still available. And if any of you are particularly interested in that sector, you can consult that work and make any use you wish to of it by going to the URL on the screen. Second reason I'm here, as the chairman also explained, is that I'm a member of two Council of Europe working groups, one concerned with the linguistic integration of adult migrants. That's a group that has organized an intergovernmental seminar back in 2008 and an intergovernmental conference in 2010, and also a working group focused on the linguistic and educational integration of children and adolescents from migrant backgrounds, a group which is organizing an intergovernmental seminar a month from now. I think when it comes to language matters, the linguistic dimension of integration, there are three things that we need to focus on. But before I go on to that, let me just explain how I'm responding to the program questions. My main focus, as by now you've gathered, is going to be with linguistic integration. And I'm going to be particularly concerned with that. My concluding remarks will briefly address the second and third questions. So when I get to question 2, you'll know the end is in sight. But I'm going to leave the issue of ethnic data collection to those more expert in the area than myself. Now, 3 challenges arising from linguistic integration that I want briefly to address. First one is the one that is particularly dear to the hearts of our politicians. It's immigrants' capacity to communicate in the language of the host country. Now, without the ability to communicate with members of the host society, it's fairly clear that integration is likely to be problematic and at best very partial. And that helps to explain why Council of Europe member states increasingly require immigrants to fulfill language requirements for entry, residence, and citizenship. Not all those member states that have a language requirement for citizenship also have one for residence, and not all those member states that have language requirements for residence and citizenship also have one for entry. We heard about the fact that the Czech Republic has introduced such a requirement. Such a requirement also exists in Germany, to mention two countries that were represented in the previous section of the conference. These requirements are usually stated in terms of the proficiency levels of the Council of Europe's Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, otherwise CEFR. We have here, however, a problem of some magnitude, because it seems to me that the CEFR is very widely misunderstood. To explain to you in detail why and how it's misunderstood would take a great deal longer than my allocated time. Let me just focus on these very general issues. First of all, the CEFR is not a set of absolute proficiency standards. It's rather a very complex descriptive apparatus. The CEFR defines proficiency in a second or foreign language in terms of contextualized language use. In other words, the things we do with language in different contexts, according to different pressures, in order to fulfill different needs. And it distinguishes between reception, in other words, listening and reading with understanding, production, speaking and writing, interaction, that's to say two-way communication or multi-way communication, which can be either spoken or written, and mediation, where one language is used to communicate messages to and from another language, in other words, translating and interpreting. But the CEFR also defines proficiency in terms of the linguistic and other competencies on which successful language use depends. And so we are constantly defining language use according to the limits of competence available to learners, but also defining competence with an eye to the context and varieties of language use in question. Now, the European Convention on Human Rights focuses above all on the individual life. And in the same kind of way, because the Common European Framework of Reference comes from the same stable and is founded on the same foundational values of the Council of Europe, that's to say human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, the CEFR is concerned with the individual language user learner. What these considerations mean is that although A2, moving from the bottom up, the second of the 6 proficiency levels, is often the one specified for immigrants, there is actually no such thing as absolute A2. If you say to me, you know this Common European Framework of Reference inside out, tell me what is A2, I will then require you first to answer all sorts of questions about the kind of learner whose proficiency you're asking me to specify. there's only, that is to say, a potentially infinite number of repertoires that can be described with reference to the Common European Framework's A2 descriptors. So this part of my message can be summarized in one sentence: specifying a CEFR level for one or another dimension of immigration is very often a blunt instrument. The second challenge that the linguistic dimension of integration poses is the relation between language learning and integration. I've already made this point in slightly different words. Without some minimal ability to communicate in the language of the host community, it's impossible to launch a meaningful process of integration. But to become truly proficient in any language, we have to live through that language for many years. That already should alert us to the assumption that seems to underlie a lot of public discussion of the issue of migrants learning the language of their host community, namely that it is a precondition for integration, and somehow that part of integration will be complete once they've passed a language test. What nonsense that is. How proficient immigrants are in the language of their host country after, for example, 10 years, is going to depend not just on them, but on the host community and the position that they are enabled to fulfill in it. One of my colleagues on the Council of Europe's working group on the linguistic integration of adult migrants was talking to an immigrant to his own country, not Ireland, and they were discussing the challenge and the difficulty of becoming proficient in the language of that country, and in particular the problem of maintaining a high level of effective motivation. The immigrant in question was having precisely difficulty in maintaining his language learning motivation. And that's what he said. What's the point of making us learn your language when no one wants to talk to us? And that brings me to the third challenge. The Council of Europe and the European Union both define integration as a two-way process, and that two-way process is, of course, what classically distinguishes it from assimilation. But in what sense can this be true of linguistic integration? Well, when children with different home languages play together, they usually learn fragments of one another's languages, and sometimes more than fragments. On the other hand, large numbers of Irish citizens are, perhaps on the face of it, unlikely to learn Polish, Latvian, or Lithuanian, the languages of the three largest immigrant groups at present in Ireland. And yet, although they may not go to classes in those languages, they may nevertheless find themselves learning a bit of the language because they're called upon to interact with, deal with speakers of one of the languages. A builder who's done work on my house at home in Dublin employs Polish workers. He told my wife recently that he considers himself 50% Polish. She asked him what he meant by 50%. Well, he said, I go up on the roof and I can more or less understand what they're on about. Whether he can or not remains, as they say, an empirical question. But if integration really is a two-way process, then we have to learn to welcome the presence of new languages. We have to understand that speaking another language at home is not a sign of disrespect for the language of the host community or its cultures or its values, far less evidence of incipient terrorism. And we also have to respond to the finding of psycholinguistic research, a finding which has been repeated over and over and over again for more than 30 years, that home languages play a crucial role in cognitive and therefore educational development. Which means that it's in our own interest, if we really want to integrate children whose home language is not the language of schooling, it's in our interest to find ways of exploiting their proficiency in their home language and possibly even helping them to develop it. The second question was, how can we measure the level of success of immigrants' integration? It seems to me there's no easy answer to this question for two reasons. First of all, integration is a long-term process, and the criteria for measuring success are going to have to change over time. How well integrated an immigrant is after 6 months may be measured. But if there is no difference in the relation between the immigrant and the host community 10 years later, we're entitled to wonder whether something's gone wrong. And secondly, because integration is a two-way process, we need to find ways of measuring the impact of immigration on the host society at the same time as, in interaction with our attempt to measure the degree of integration achieved by individual immigrants and perhaps immigrant communities. And the third question, are there differences in integration among various groups of immigrants? Well, of course there are. Immigrant groups differ from one another in culture, ethnicity, and language, also in their educational background and achievement, though in those latter dimensions, one also inevitably finds enormous variation within particular communities. That's why, in the days of Integrate Ireland, our intensive English language courses were designed to identify individual learner needs, because we had to recognize that integration is in the end an individual process, and linguistic integration requires the identification and then adequately responding to individual communicative needs. Note that term, individual needs, because in our attempts to respond to the challenges of integration, we must never forget that immigrants are first and foremost individuals with individual rights and individual responsibilities. And that brings me back to the Council of Europe and the European Convention on Human Rights. I think I may have been a minute or two over 15. If you're interested in finding out more about the Council of Europe's work on the linguistic integration of immigrants, go to the URL on the screen now, www.coe.int/lang, and follow the link on the left-hand menu to migrants. And you will find there more material than you ever imagined you would have time enough to read. If you have been, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening.